So let's connect the dots between last week and this week. The once united kingdom under King David's rule has divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern called Israel, the southern called Judah. The northern comprised of the 10 tribes, the southern comprised of the 2 tribes. I'm just going off script, and I only had 1 coffee, so bear with me. It's gonna be a bumpy ride. Like Hosea, the prophet Isaiah lived in the 8th century BC. Hosea lived in the north, Isaiah lived in the south. It's quite unlikely that they knew about each other. Twitter and Facebook had not yet come into usage by the people. #exile. I'm not even sorry. That's not even in it. Like, I'm just, wow. Stick to the script, Foxall. Hosea lived to experience the fall of the northern kingdom of Assyria, or the northern kingdom to the Assyrian Empire. Assyria then also attempted to overthrow the south, but they couldn't quite take out Jerusalem. In the not too distant future, however, the Babylonian Empire will more than succeed where Assyria fell short. So it's not good times for the people of God. Now, it's helpful to remember what the role of a prophet truly is. Frederick Buechner wrote that the title prophet means spokesperson, not fortune teller. And the one whom in their unfathomable audacity the prophets claimed to speak for was God. In the presence of a prophet, no one was ever comfortable, with a total lack of tact. They roared out against phoniness and corruption wherever they found it. Prophets were the terror of kings, temple leaders, and other officials who ruled over the people. A prophet's quarrel with the world, according to Buechner, is deep down a lover's quarrel. If they didn't love the world, they probably wouldn't bother to tell it that it's going to hell. They'd just let it go. I'm quoting someone else, by the way. Their quarrel is God's quarrel. And yes, in case you're wondering, we absolutely do still have prophets among us today. One of them, I believe, is a 16-year-old climate activist, currently on a 4-week sail across the Atlantic to Madrid to attend another international climate change gathering, boldly, brazenly speaking truth to power in the face of kings and empires. Last week, Hosea was God's spokesperson, and he presented to us a God who felt like the frustrated and heartbroken parent of a wayward child, the child whose idolatry and greed and injustice for his own benefit was deserving of punishment. But God's righteous fury was overwhelmed by a churning heart, a heart of love for the prodigal child. And though God refused to lift a divine hand against Israel, against the northern kingdom, it didn't mean happy days ahead for the people, because they still had to face the consequences of their own actions. Assyria would obliterate the 10 tribes to the north. In the south, the prophet Isaiah, like his northern counterpart, was speaking on God's behalf, but this time to the wayward kingdom of Judah in the south. This time, God wasn't presenting as a frustrated parent, though. This time, God was the angry owner of a mismanaged vineyard. So let's look again at the reading from chapter 5, because I actually want to give Isaiah some points for creativity here. You see, he draws his listeners in by parodying a love song. Now, this technique is as old as time, right? Using music as a vehicle for social critique. From John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance to my favorite, Rage Against the Machine's Killing in the Name of. Music has often been used to communicate resistance and challenge to a sin-sick world. Isaiah is clever. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. And I don't know if he was a bass or a tenor, but I imagine him singing, my beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. Then Isaiah hits us with the 2x4. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. Wait, what? And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, the prophet demands on God's behalf, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there for me to do for my vineyard that I have not done for it already? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Okay, so now Isaiah has our attention. God is frustrated, vexed at having expected one thing and yet received another. To expect is to live in hope or anticipation of a future outcome. In fact, in Hebrew, the verbs for expect and hope are very closely related. Add to that this agrarian imagery that makes this hope actually entirely reasonable, right? You plant a radish, you get a radish, sing two characters from The Fantastics, an off-Broadway musical. For societies attuned to seasons of planting and harvest, it is natural to expect a plant to realize its genetic destiny when planted in well-cultivated, fertile ground. You expect it to produce an abundance of good fruit. But to quote The Fantastics again, children are bewildering, and you never know what you've got till they're grown. The harvest God planted and tended wasn't coming through as expected, as hoped. God's question to the people of Jerusalem and Judah expresses a similar bewilderment. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? The conditions for a bumper crop of delicious grapes were all there, so why am I looking at wild grapes? So here's where the thinly veiled metaphor is actualized here in the last verse of the song. Isaiah says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed. Righteousness, but heard a cry." As Old Testament scholar Joseph Blenkinsop has noted in his commentary on Isaiah, the use of the word pair justice and righteousness, what that does and what that triggers is a vision of a just social order in which the rights of all people, including the most marginalized, the destitute, the orphans and widows, are respected. The wordplay in Hebrew isn't captured by our English translations. Nevertheless, Isaiah delivers a devastating critique. Where God looked for justice, mishpat, there was bloodshed, mispah. And instead of righteousness, tzedekah, there was outcry, tza'aka. Suffice it to say that the resulting harvest of God's vineyard is not simply poor or inadequate, it is downright evil. Well, you know who else who favored the metaphor of a vineyard or a field or a crop? The Sunday school answer is correct. Jesus, there it is. Way to go, Knox. I know, I lost you in the first quarter, it's fine. Jesus' parables are littered with agrarian metaphors for the life of faith, because parables and metaphors inspire new ways of thinking by putting two dissimilar things together. And this was one of Jesus' favorite pairings. Through this pairing, it becomes possible to see familiar things in a new way. So we're given an opportunity for reflection here. All right? For example, I'll come up with a few, but maybe you have your own questions or ponderings. Comparing God to a vintner, a gardener, a farmer. What does it do to our understanding of God to imagine God as hopeful? Think about that. Not knowing for certain the outcome of divine labor and care. Calvin is rolling over in his grave. I'm okay with that. When we plant seeds, we can do everything we can to encourage the growth, but in the end, all we can do is wait and watch, right? Wait and watch and hope, sort of like parenting. Hope they'll take root and grow and bear the fruit that they are destined to bear. Speaking of fruit, speaking of destiny, according to the prophets, it would appear that the fruit God anticipates, what God hopes for, is more than just the salvation of individual souls. Are you still with me, Knox? It appears that what God hopes for is more than just the salvation of individual souls, but for the establishment of a just and righteous society. And now the Christian fundamentalists are rolling in their grave, and I'm okay with that too. Let's keep going. Let's keep pushing this metaphor. What else does Isaiah's prophecy and God's agrarian imagery invite us to imagine and consider? Well, perhaps, like plants and animals, there's meant to be something predictable about human nature. The metaphor suggests it is the divine intention of human nature to produce just societies, that is what we are designed to do. Grapes, not wild grapes. That is the fruit that we are meant to bear. So it makes sense that God, the gardener, would be shocked to find that what was planted and cultivated had produced something so vile. What more was there to do for my vineyard, God said, that I have not done in it already? There's in fact nothing else God could do. And so God declares that he will tear down all of his good work and allow the vineyard to revert to a wasteland. I'll tell you what I'll do to my vineyard, says God through the prophet. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I'll break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed. There's no chancel guild anymore for this vineyard. And it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. And just for good measure, I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. The vineyard would be left to its own demise. The Assyrians would invade each kingdom, carting off some of the survivors while leaving a path of absolute destruction in their wake. Like in Hosea's prophecy to the north, Isaiah says to the south, God will not strike you in wrath. That is not who God is. But God will allow you to feel and experience the consequences of your own actions as a society, your own mismanagement of the vineyard. And folks, this is a theological issue, right? And actually, since I'm not a farmer, I feel it more instinctively in the parenting metaphor from last week. It works both ways. God's actions towards the people have been consistently gracious and merciful, we would agree, correct? But then at what point does all this gracious action become enabling? Sit with that for just a second. That is, at what point does being overly gracious allow the destructive behavior to continue? Do you get what I'm saying? There comes a point where should God continue to heap fertilizer on this vineyard, it's just going to continue to produce wild grapes in abundance. It's letting the bully get away with it and get away with it and get away with it and get away with it. It's not stopping at 3 strikes, but allowing someone to stay at the plate and hog the entire inning. Too much graciousness would, in fact, enable the injustice and destructive behavior to continue. This is actually, or it would be, this would be cheap grace, gospel without law. It's the kind that we convince ourselves of when we continue in patterns of self-destruction and sin because we know, God will just forgive me anyway. But passages like this one, in fact, many of the challenging words brought by the prophets, remind us to consider that at some point, the confrontational word, the judgment, the challenge is needed to interrupt patterns of destruction, to call people to attention. Enough is enough. People are suffering. I planted grapes. Why am I looking at wild grapes? So God removes the hedges and the irrigation system and allows the vineyard to go wild. And it gets mowed down. All that is left are the stumps. It's as good as dead. But then, Isaiah 11, right? Even as the people are unfaithful, God is faithful. And since Genesis 1, God has been in the business of creating order out of chaos, bringing life out of death. God is the original gardener, and he knows a thing or two about plants. He's got divine agrarian wisdom. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Well, do you remember who Jesse is? Jesse is the father of David, the young shepherd boy who rose to become king. Jesse of the tribe of Judah, who lived in Bethlehem, of all places, some backwater town in the southern kingdom. Hear the promise. Even as the vineyard is mowed down, and it looks like there's no hope for continued life, out of the stump of Jesse would come a shoot. Out of the roots, a branch. Hope springs eternal. And some of you will recall, I preached on this last year, so of course you remember, that God made a promise to King David that a descendant of his would always sit on the throne. Always. It was back when David wanted to build a temple for God. And God said to David, thanks, but I'm good. Instead, I will build you a house or a lineage or a dynasty. But by Isaiah's time, people didn't know what to make of this promise, since David's heirs had stopped sitting on the thrones within 2 or 3 generations of David. So it was the prophets who helped the people catch the vision that God's promise was about more than earthly kings. God's promise to David and to all people was the Messiah, the Christ. One descendant of David, but whose leadership and governance would produce the hoped for, the anticipated fruit of God's people. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, Isaiah says, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord, not rebellion. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. The Messiah would be the one to guide us in achieving our intended divine destiny as just and righteous societies. where all people are valued, all people are cared for, and all people can thrive. Out of death, God brings new life. Out of a stump comes a shoot, something new, resurrection. Prophets, you see, cast a vision of the future into our present. In the 20th chapter of John's Gospel, so hop up to the New Testament with me for a second. In the 20th chapter of John's Gospel, the devastated Mary is weeping outside of the tomb of her rabbi Jesus when she spies a man standing before her. She assumes that it's the gardener. And we laugh at her mistake, but she wasn't wrong. Yes, it was the resurrected Jesus, the Messiah, the shoot out of Jesse's stump, but she wasn't wrong. God has always been the gardener. God has always been the gardener. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. That's what the prophet crooned. Radishes can be counted on to be radishes, but children are bewildering. Human beings need something more to realize their proper destiny. The promise functions in this way by bringing a vision of the future into the turbulence and destruction of the present. Isaiah told Judah about a shoot, a green bit of life coming out of a dead stump. Cut down, but not destroyed. We are unfaithful, but God is faithful. Today, in the midst of our own societies of injustice and greed and rebellion and nihilism, we can prophetically speak of a future, a promise that cuts into our cynicism with a compelling vision that captures our imagination, our hope, and claims our loyalty, that reminds us and invites us to fulfill our divine destiny as beacons of light and justice and blessing in the world. In the person of Jesus, we still see that sense of the future coming into the present, challenging the forces that would draw us into cynicism, and to the forces that make us say, no way. God says, I will make a way. Out of a field of stumps and death, I will bring forth shoots and branches. Just wait and see. Just wait and see. Advent is in the air. The Messiah is coming. To God be all the glory. Amen.